Good afternoon, everybody. Rinhan Dar. Can everybody hear me?
Thank you. I'd like to pay a particular welcome to any members of the public who are joining us this afternoon. This is an extraordinary board meeting to consider the recommendations of the vacant practice panel in respect of Solva surgery. Are there any apologies?
Yes, Chair. We have apologies from Dr. Phil Clare, and he's represented by Mr. Mark Henwood, and we've also apologies from Dr. Joe McCarthy, Chair.
Thank you. Welcome, Mark, and I think we have Rian Bond as well as the Assistant Director of Primary Care joining us, so warm welcome, Rian. Do we have any declarations of interest? No? Okay, thank you. We'll go on to item 2.1, which is the primary care contractual applications and the report in respect of Solva surgery.
Thank you, Chair. Again, thank you. As you said, we're here today to consider the outcomes of the vacant practice panel meeting. But what I'd like to do, Chair, is take board members through some of the issues within the paper that we've considered that have led to the recommendations that we're going to be putting before the board today. And we're here, as you know, as a consequence of the fact that on the 8th of December, Solva Surgery terminated its contract with the Health Board as a consequence of the planned retirement of Dr. Sujan Judavi, who then had to give us 3 months' notice with her planned retirement to take effect from the 31st of March. I'd really like to begin, Chair, with thanking Dr. Sujan for her service. She's been in Solva since 2012, and we know through the public engagement events and the discussions with the patients registered with the surgery, they've really valued the service that Dr. Sujan has provided, and indeed the practice team. I'd also like to thank, before we begin today, all of those patients who have taken the time to engage with us over this period, and members of the local community, representatives of practices, and other stakeholders who have given us their views to help to inform the outcome and the recommendations that we're putting forward today. I think as well, what I'd want to say at this point is that we've had responses. We've had over 1,000 responses by questionnaire. We know that at the public engagement event, following the first vacant practice panel meeting, we had 274 people attend that event, so about 10% of the practice population engaged with us through that event. There were other opportunities through email, through letter. We've had numerous letters into the Health Board, so people have taken the real opportunity to tell us how important Solva surgery is to them in the provision of services locally. So we summarised at the last board meeting, Chair, that we've made a decision from the first vacant practice panel meeting to go to the public to talk to them about the 2 options that were feasible within the very short timescale that we had to respond to within the 3-month period. And that was to discuss the options of a managed dispersal for patients to a practice that is closest to their home address, or for the Health Board to take over the practice as a managed practice of the Health Board. And both of those options have risks and benefits, and these were what we wanted to talk to the patients about. Some of the themes that came out of the engagement particularly relate to the impact of the closure of a surgery that seemed to be so important to the local community. There was concern raised around travel to another practice, even though some of those practices may be closer to their home. They talked about parking, which is available in Solva, and some of those facilities don't appear to exist in other practices. They talked about the concerns about continuity of care and the value that they had from the friendly staff at Solva and the continuity of care that they've enjoyed over a number of years. There was certainly concern around the future of the dispensing service, and I'll pick up that issue in more detail shortly. And patients have valued the ability to get their medication dispensed at a local surgery because, of course, there isn't a community pharmacy within Solva. But there was also concern around the issue of practice dispersal. There was a general feeling from patients that neighbouring practices were full and would really struggle to accommodate extra patients on their list and to be able to provide timely and quality care for additional patients that could be dispersed to them. So alongside the patient engagement, we also ran some stakeholder engagement events and talked to both stakeholders internal to the Health Board and external stakeholders. We met with all neighbouring GMS practices, we talked to local community pharmacies, we met with local politicians, and we also engaged with members of the Solva community through that engagement event. A virtual meeting took place with the council and community council representatives on the 30th of January. And again, all of that feedback has fed into the outcomes that we're considering today. One of the things that, as I say, really came through very strongly throughout all of this was the issue of dispensing. And I think it's very important to clarify at this point, Chair, that we have considered that issue, but it's important to confirm that the dispensing rights with the current GP, independent contractor, they are named rights that sit with that individual. And our legal advice has confirmed that cannot transfer to either a dispersed practice or a managed practice. So we do know that whatever the outcome is reached today, the dispensing service will cease at this point on the 31st of March. However, we do have the pharmaceutical needs assessment, which was introduced as a statutory regulation from 2021. And the process that we would undertake following that decision is that we would use the pharmaceutical needs assessment to assess what gap in services the termination of that dispensing service would create. It would mean some further patient engagement and engagement with our public, but that would be the service that we would look to use to determine what else we would need to provide within the local community. But in the meantime, the Community Health Council have agreed to work with the local population to assist them in terms of accessing other community pharmacies. And again, there are benefits that local community pharmacies can provide with a range of services that will not have been provided through a dispensing service. And it's also important that I raise at this point that as part of our due diligence work that we've been doing as part of the consideration of the future arrangements, we have identified that there have been some concerns raised around the governance issues within the dispensing service that currently exists. We have put a remedial action plan in place to ensure that it can be safely delivered to the right standard for the remainder of the weeks that exist up until the 31st of March. We've also engaged with neighbouring GMS practices, and again, this was really important in consideration of the issue of dispersal of patients to any of those neighbouring practices. And the 4 practices that would be affected are Fishguard, St David's, and 2 Hampton West practices, Winch Lane and St Thomas's. And what the Health Board did as part of that was to use some software modelling to take the postcode address of every registered patient with Solva and to map them to the nearest practice should they not be going to Solva in the future. And that led to the numbers that you'll see in your paper that should we be looking at a managed dispersal, there would be a range of patients that would go to each of those practices, but by far the biggest number would be dispersed to St David's practice. All of the responses from each of those practices are within the appendices, but by far, as I say, the greatest response and concerns came from St David's practice, who would, if it were to be a managed practice, be expected to absorb 70% of the patients currently registered with Solva. That's something like 1,700 patients. And they expressed real concern about the impact of that number on their own services and their ability to absorb that number of patients and provide the level of quality of care that they would wish to provide to all of their patients. They expressed concern around their workforce and their capacity, the size of their surgery and their ability to do that at this point, such to the point that it may also affect them that they would have to consider terminating their own contract. Such was the seriousness of that consequence for them. So we took all of this information into the second vacant practice panel meeting that met on the 13th of February. And I'm pleased to say that we were supported by the LMC and the CHC in that meeting. The LMC represented the practice voices and the CHC clearly the voice of members of the community. There was a robust discussion on all of the issues that we were considering, and we recognised that neither offered the desired outcome for a long-term sustainable solution for services for the registered practice population of Solva. The practice recognised the concerns about the challenges of staffing a medical rota in a managed health board practice. As the board knows, we already have 5 managed practices, and anyone who runs one practice will understand the challenges, let alone the challenge of running 5 as we currently do so. We often have to rely on locums to support medical rotas, and that was a particular concern for the panel in thinking through the options. However, it was, unanimously agreed that notwithstanding the risks in the short term, that the panel would recommend to the health board today that the health board should take over the provision of general medical services for the registered population of Solva surgery via a health board managed practice for a period of 12 months initially, during which time further work would be undertaken to secure the future service provision, including more detailed discussions with the local community. Now, as part of the work that we've done, the panel also recognised that there were some 295 patients registered currently with Solva who live outside of the practice boundary. And it was recommended that they would be communicated with in writing and removed and managed to be relocated to another practice closer to their home address. So I'd like to bring to you today the recommendations that the vacant practice panel is making today, Chair. I'd be asking that the health board would note the work undertaken as part of the vacant practice panel process and the associated patient and stakeholder feedback, that the health board would support the recommendation from the vacant practice panel meeting on the 13th of February, that the ongoing provision of general medical services for patients currently registered with Solva surgery should be transferred to a health board managed practice from the 1st of April, and that the health board will review that arrangement within 12 months. I would ask that the board agree that a working group with members of the Solva community and partner agencies, primary care contractors and the health board is established with clear terms of reference to explore a solution for the ongoing provision of sustainable services for Solva and the North Pembrokeshire Peninsula, in line with the health board's strategic direction, and to report back to the health board by December 2023. I would also ask that the board agree that in the event that there appeared to be instances of repeated failure of the medical rota in that managed practice situation, with a failure to secure adequate levels of cover, that the board be asked to review its decision, as we would do with any managed practice. But we recognise that the very pertinent issues of when considering a smaller practice that may only have a single GP rota. And finally, Chair, I would ask the board consider that and agree that patients who have been identified as living outside of the practice boundary are advised in writing that they would be removed from the practice in line with an allocation to a practice that is geographically closer to their home address. And in doing so, of course, an appeals process would be established to consider any exceptional cases that may arise as a consequence of that. So, Chair, those are the recommendations that the vacant practice panel have made and that I would now ask the board to consider.
Many thanks, Jill, and thank you so much to you and the team, Rhiannon and everybody else, for the intense listening exercise and consideration of all the evidence at such short notice. I'm going to open up to members of the board for any questions. If you could indicate by raising a hand, either in the screen or with an icon. The boardroom.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. That's from myself. First of all, I would like to echo what you said about Jill's work and the work of the team, and also as well as in conducting this engagement event and the very detailed papers we've received, particularly the slide deck, Solva surgery, which I think is a brilliant summary of all those, all that feedback, and the actual paper itself. My question actually is in terms of to some extent, the now and the immediate future. And I just want to know if there's been consideration to considering the medical resource that we have within the team in the health board and also the management resource to be able to take forward the work involved in another managed practice. As the board knows, we've recently taken on Nayland and Johnston, And, you know, both these practices, as well as the others, do require work to work with the local community and with various groups to come up with a plan for the future, as well as the issue of managing and obtaining locum cover, which I do think is helped by having additional medical support to take a lead on that. So I wanted to know if that had been considered either by the primary care team or the wider executive team.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I think it's a really important point. There is very limited capacity in the primary care team at present, and they do a fantastic job, I have to say, in terms of supporting the practices that we do manage. But we would most definitely benefit from additional medical capacity within the team. We have struggled to find the right level of clinical leadership in two of our current managed practices at this point, and we do rely then on the existing medical support that we've got to provide some of that input to practices. We do a lot of work around quality and governance with our managed practices, and our medical cover, again, is really important in that, as well as for the issues that you've raised, Judith, in terms of supporting us more generally in this, and with that local cover, making sure that we've got the right level of quality. In addition to that, there are two other posts that we feel that we would need to support the team. One in terms of the sustainability issues and looking at the general management and ongoing operational issues of those managed practices, and also working with Lee and the team in terms of something I think more general around that transformation, because I think a lot of work, as we've reflected here, needs to be done across our patch in thinking more generally in line with our strategy about how we manage our general medical services and other primary care services going forward. And we talk in this paper about the need to think more strategically about the North Peninsula, for example. So some support in the development of our model, which is very much in line with our health board strategy over the next 8 to 10 years, but we really robustly must grow our primary and community services. So I think that medical capacity, along with some other posts, would be very helpful. I haven't got a business case and a funding model for that yet. I have signalled my interest in these posts to the wider executive team, and that, you know, that support is taken into consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. In the paper, you mentioned, I think it's on page 8 of 10, exactly about needing to develop an opportunity to develop the strategy for the peninsula, and then coming back to us in December with, you know, an outcome of the working group. And as you've just said, this will be our 6th managed practice, coming quite quickly on the back of the 5th managed practice. And listening to some of the public and the neighbouring GPs, people are saying about new GPs are looking for a mixed portfolio, don't necessarily want to take on a financial responsibility for a practice when they already have student loans and mortgages. And I understand in Scotland that managed practices, particularly in rural areas, are becoming more common. So I wondered, and listening to what you said about the additional medical capacity in the team for managed practices now in the near future, but I'm thinking even medium long term, general management, and also the transformation, working closely with the Director of Planning. Could we expect the primary care strategy overall, including our recommendations in relation to managed practices in Hywel Dda, to come to us by December as well?
Thank you, Chair, for that question. I think it's a really important question, because we may not have the finished model by then for a wider health board strategy, but I think we would certainly want to be engaging with the local community in terms of that North Peninsula work, and we have visited some of that work before. There's a wider context that you raised there, not only about local services, but in terms of the sort of hybrid model that we need to be thinking about, not here just locally, but also across Wales. And we've started some of those conversations nationally. And because there will probably be going forward, I think, across Wales, that hybrid model of managed practices, salaried posts, independent contractor status, possibly APMS models as well, alternative provider medical services. So again, thinking very strategically around the models that are going to work. As you say, doctors coming through the system these days want different things. So I'm confident that we will start that work and hopefully move that forward for discussions around the North Peninsula, and bring to you or bring back to the board certainly a plan. I'm not saying that we would have been able to have finished that plan, but I would expect that we are able to get onto this as soon as possible, and therefore to start that discussion with the local community and to think about the model that's going to fit for Solva and the North Peninsula going forward. But there are some very big conversations, I think, that are wider than just the health board in terms of models of care that we're going to need to consider going forward, and conversations with our population also in terms of their expectations around services going forward. And it's also certainly not going to rely just on doctors. It's about that multi-professional team and the models that we are able to develop within our communities to provide services going forward.
Thanks, Jill. I'll come back to that, but I've got a few people who wish to ask questions first. So I'm going to ask Anna, I think the boardroom again. I'm not sure who in the boardroom, and Delith.
Thanks, Chair. I just wonder if I should give way to the boardroom just in case that's a follow-on point before I change the course of the conversation, Steve.
No, that's fine, Anna.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. So Jill, thank you so much for a very clear set of papers, a remarkably speedy process. So thank you to you and your team, but I think also thanks are due to the community of Solva for this very active engagement in a very constructive manner, and that is just a joy for us as a health board grappling with some very knotty issues that face our communities in Solva and beyond. So I think that's important to recognise. I wonder if I could just ask a question around this sort of proviso that if we were to go down the managed practice route, and if the medical rota turned out to be so fragile that it was proving risky to try to pursue that, what is your evaluation of that risk? You know, how likely do you feel that that is going to happen? And second, what would the plan be in that scenario? Thank you.
Well, thank you. You know, it's the sort of situation one hopes one will never get to. And I may bring Rhiannon in. So Rhiannon, just a heads up, may bring Rhiannon in to help with some of the thinking that we know now about the rota. We do have situations within our existing managed practices where I get a call from the team to say, Jill, there is a risk that we're facing some no doctor days coming up in 2 days' time or whatever. And I have to say the team work very, very hard on a daily basis to be ringing around and trying to secure rotas. And we're grateful actually to some of the locums who work with us on a consistent basis across our practices. But there is a real risk that we get to that point. And I certainly cannot put out a notice to say to patients, sorry, the surgery's closed, please go to A&E. That's just not an acceptable position. So when we have reached those situations, we really work very hard to think about who else have we got in the practice, what medical cover can we provide from some of our other managed practices, what remote input can we provide from a medical cover perspective. You know, we have a statutory duty to provide general medical services, but we also have a duty to provide safe services. And if it did come to a point at which I felt there was a real concern around the quality and safety of our ability to provide services, I would be meeting with the medical director and the assistant medical director who is in my team to have that conversation about the level of risk that we were reaching. But we would be doing everything right up until that point to try to secure whatever medical capacity that we could do to prevent that from happening. So it is something that we've got very close to previously. So, you know, I wouldn't want members of the public to feel that even in taking the decision around a managed practice, that it isn't without risk. But what we're trying to do already is to scope out the locums that we know are already working within the practice, other individuals that may be interested. We're trying to seek already in a proactive way ahead of this, what capacity we might have and how we work through that situation. So it would then have to probably be a very urgent conversation if we got to that point with the executive team, the chief executive, to work with us to take a decision if ever we got that. So we do have to plan that contingency, but I hope that we could avoid it. But we've got very, very close to that. And if we were in a situation where that was something we were experiencing on a very regular basis, that would be the point at which, with the chief executive and executive team, we would be recommending that we have to come back to the board, because our experience in terms of being able to sustain this is proving to be very, very challenging. But as I say, the team make absolutely every effort to avoid the situation becoming a reality when we face those situations in other practices. But it's a very important question that you raise.
Thanks,
So I think
Jill.
if I may come in, Chair, is that okay?
Yes, please, Steve.
Thank you. I mean, just to reiterate the comments, I think a really sound piece of work, a really committed community, and that is really valuable to us to hear and have the strength of those voices amongst us. And that to an extent also, I think, helps to reduce the risk that Anna's just highlighted. You know, a very committed community can help us with what will be a situation which will have some risks in it for us, but a risk that we feel absolutely worth taking. I wanted to come back to the wider point that you raised, Maria, that the Vice Chair also raised, around what the future of general medical services generally ought to be. And I think the emerging feeling is firstly that we do need to have a debate. I think at our level about what that looks like. Our demographics are really quite concerning, particularly when it comes to GPs, but I think that's a more general primary care concern that's growing as well. What we have, I think, at the moment is is some things that we can see do work, like our integrated care centres. They seem to have been able to come a long way in stabilising some practices that previously we were concerned about. But of course, they only work in certain communities with a certain critical mass. So I think, to pick up what you said, Maria, my view is increasingly that we're going to have to come up with a mosaic of solutions, some of which may be more managed, or some communities where those are quite small but really important to those, because we are serving a very rural community, as we know, to all the way through to the things we've signalled in our longer term strategy around integrated care centres. And I think we need to have that debate. I know it's going on in Scotland and indeed in England as well, and I think it's something that we can hold our agenda for Wales, because otherwise we're going to have this continued sort of one issue after another, and I think we need a bit of a better plan. So we may not have all the answers to that by December. I think that the Solva community gives us an opportunity to model something different in that community, which could add to that mosaic. But I do think we can bring back something which we can start to see what the long-term sustainable future is, because in the end, as demonstrated, I think, by the strength of feeling, this is a real worry for local populations, and we've got to try and take that away in the longer term.
Thanks, Steve. I think the board would really, really welcome that. I think this is the right time for this board to have the debate, perhaps in parallel to the national debate feeding into it. But I think it's more apparent in our rural area. And I think it would bring, it would give confidence to the public that we're here to serve. And in that debate, you know, the consideration and picking up on Anna's question, the additional medical capacity in the team with the current risks with 6 practices, perhaps that's a debate that comes before then. But I leave that's an operational debate, really. But yes, we'd really welcome that. If we could aim for December, that would be most welcome. Can I bring in Delith?
Thank you, Chair. And really, it's picking up on future-proofing GP services, but actually preventative and early intervention services for our population. And I noticed that in the papers, the majority of the respondents were over 55. And my concern is that we haven't heard the voices of our younger population, i.e. under 45, and children and young people, and whether or not there is some other information that we need to really consider about how we deliver primary care and community care for future-proofing our services. And maybe we need some further information from the Solva group as to how they could give us some steer in how we do that as well. So it's really thinking about future-proofing. And I don't know about other provision, if we do manage the service, about maternity and postnatal care, because I can't see that there's much information about that either. And would we expand the type of services that we deliver in a hub? Thank you.
Thanks, Delith. I don't know if, Jill, would you like to make any comments on that?
Yes, I think so. I mean, clearly in terms of general medical services, there's a limit in terms of what we would be expected to provide. But I think within that hub, there is an opportunity to think about the range of services that can be provided locally. And as the Chief Executive has already raised, within our integrated care centres, that gives us a wider opportunity. So we would normally base that on the population needs assessment, and we would be thinking about what are the specific needs that are within that community that we would need to be meeting. And we would be thinking more generally for an integrated hub around that wider peninsular need. So thinking about what are the priorities for that North cluster and how we would meet those. So whether it was maternity, whether it was something more around preventative services and involving, as you say, Delith, the information from our younger generation in terms of services that they would also need to see. So we would take all of that into account in terms of developing our future model.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Chantal, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think my question really relates to when I was reading the responses from those who engaged with the process, there was some concerns around those who are the most vulnerable in that particular area, and in particular those who are aged over a certain age. And I'm just kind of wondering how would we communicate those new arrangements to ensure that they did understand that or that they were aware of the service that we are providing for them in that 12-month period. And also, secondly, once we go over the 12-month period, whatever the arrangements will be in the future, that this will come back to the board in order for us to be able to ensure that we are serving the needs of that particular community. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. I will bring in Rhiannon just to set out the process that happens. And we've been in very close communication by letter with every registered member of the practice throughout this process. So I'll bring Rhiannon in now in terms of how we communicate the outcome, and then what our plans would be going forward. Perhaps not that we've formulated that yet in terms of the wider working group and how we communicate. But Rhiannon, would you like to set out the sort of next steps that we normally operationally take in these circumstances, please?
Thanks, Jill, and thanks, Chantal, for your question. Yes, so we will be prepared with communication to patients as well as to other stakeholders in the area to let them know the outcome, and there will be communications and media statements around that as well. As part of the vacant practice panel discussions, one of the questions that I specifically asked was, with the Community Health Council moving into their new role as well, how could we work jointly to make sure that we are educating patients on the range of services that are available for them and how we support them to have best access to those services as well. So this will be an ongoing piece of work that we'll be undertaking with the practice if it becomes part of the Health Board managed practice portfolio, and we'll be looking to support the staff in the signposting arrangements that they need to put in place as well. So it'll be an ongoing conversation for patients and with stakeholders, Chantal, as we move over the next 6 to 12 months.
Thank you very much for that, Rhiannon.
Thank you, Ewan.
Thank you, Chair. Without wanting to repeat colleagues' comments, I very much again, welcome the input of all the community there in Solva in terms of looking at a workable solution which we can all kind of sign up to, hopefully, and kind of move forward on collectively. But I think my kind of note of caution and kind of slight concern is, whilst this is a fantastic kind of baseline model, perhaps it's not the model which perhaps we should look at for the whole of the Hywel Dda kind of 3 counties approach. Because when you look at the demography of Solva, it is quite different. The respondents to the survey, 2/3 of which were over 55, and echoing kind of Delith's comments as well, what about our future generations? What do they want? What do they need? And I think we have to kind of make sure that somehow we engage and communicate with that younger population, because they are our future service users, and we need to future-proof our actual services going forward. Yes, we need to look and deal with what's in front of us, absolutely, because that is paramount to the community of Solva. But I think we shouldn't take the model and actually then kind of deploy it verbatim across the whole of the 3 counties, because we have a lot of population in Solva and on the peninsula who are of a certain age and above. Obviously, we have a lot of people who have moved out because they can't afford to live in that area as well, particularly younger families. And I think what we need to look at is taking a baseline approach from Solva in terms of the community engagement, which has been fantastic, the activism and passion, which again has to be applauded. But we have to look at each community individually, because each community across our 3 counties is bespoke in terms of their needs. I mean, you know, if we were looking at a GP practice which was closing in the kind of east of Carmarthenshire, it's a very different population, very different demography. So the Solva model wouldn't work in terms of its transference there. So I think, yes, it's great that we've had this commitment from the population of Solva, but it is not a model which I think is something which can be deployed across the 3 counties. We have to look at each community on its own merit and look at the demography, because Solva is very different. There's a lot of inward migration there. A lot of retirees go there because they thought, you know, there would be a GP practice to look after their concerns for years to come, and hopefully will continue to do so. But it is an aging population. And what about our future population? So that's my concern, I think, just for noting as part of a longer term discussion and a positive approach that we as a health board want to take with our population.
Thanks, you. And that reinforces the need for a strategy, really, which reflects that diversity. I'm going to go to the boardroom. Steve, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just 2 points on that, and thanks you and for the reflection. I think you're absolutely right. I think this discussion around what our longer term strategy needs to be is certainly not a one size fits all, and there are differences in how people access care depending on their age, depending on where they live, and so on, and also, of course, our different abilities to get GPs and other primary care clinicians into particular areas. So that's why I think this will be very much a hybrid model of different things at work, and why the strategy, I think, needs some real thought, because there are the needs and ways in which our population access services is changing, particularly with young people. And I don't want to say young people are the only ones who use digital, but certainly there is a desire, much more desire for that going forward, probably from all our age groups. So I think on that front, that's probably why over the summer, my intention would be that we have board seminar discussions around what is it that we're trying to fix here? What is it that we have already learned from our current experience of managed practices, integrated care centres and other things? And what might be the framework against which we can start to put together a much more comprehensive primary care strategy, essentially, to deal with the long-term sustainability. And that, I imagine, will be made up of a multi-layered approach with different ways in, but that's going to require a lot of discussion. So what comes back in December I think will be the opening of that. But what we will have by then, really positively, is real on-the-ground example of community, an activated community in Solva with a relatively small practice, who can tell us and help us to learn what would work in those sorts of situations as part of this wider model. The other thing just to mention, yeah, you're right, real concerns in the area around accommodation generally, particularly for young people, but not exclusively. One of the things we want to do in the community group that we're establishing, and I raised it and had a quick discussion with the Chief Executive of Pembrokeshire Council, is making sure the council is part of that discussion, because clearly they have wider responsibilities and desire to try and address some of the accommodation issues that we see across Pembrokeshire, and there may be some opportunities here.
Thank you, Steve. Maynard.
A different matter. I noticed that the actual practice premises belong to the current practitioner, and that they're willing to talk about a lease to the health board. In the short term, the lease is obviously the better option, but in the longer term, are there options being considered to purchase the premises if necessary, and what are the relative costs of both options?
Jill, can you come in on that, or
Rhian?
I'll start, and I'm sure Rhian will come into that. At the moment, yes, we understand we might have the option to lease this in the short term. I think it would be very much then considering what the longer term approach is going to be in terms of Solva and the North Peninsula in terms of buildings that we would need going into the longer term. Our shared services team would need to be negotiating this on our behalf. There would be some, in any case, and I'll ask Rhian to come in on this point, and whenever we find ourselves in this situation of a managed practice situation, and we do have to do due diligence work with our estates team and shared services to review the existing building and to ensure that it meets the standard of care that we would be able to deliver services from. So that work will have to start very quickly. We weren't able clearly to preempt that because we needed to arrive at a point today. So we would be getting on with that and then considering what the options were. So there'll be some all Wales guidance in terms of costs that we would be working with, but I'll bring Rhian in terms of the sort of practical issues that we would be looking at. But we won't have those costs immediately available today, Maynard, but I'll ask Rhian to comment.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Maynard. Yes, so we will start work initially with our own estates team. So we'll be looking at fire safety and other immediately necessary issues to the building that we have to have an assurance over. And then we will, as Jill said, be working with a specialist estates team in the shared services partnership who will give us our advice around standard lease agreements and terms that we need to consider as a health board. That will then obviously, as we've discussed, form part of the longer term strategy, not just for this practice, but for other health board managed practices. I think we need to consider that wider piece of work. And I know that there is a request for a paper for board on the managed practice strategy coming up into a future meeting. So hopefully, Maynard, it's something that we'll be able to consider in the round. But as Jill said, it's not something we have costed at the moment, but it's something that we can certainly pull that information together on as we think about that longer term vision.
Thank you, Rhian.
Just supplementary. Sorry, one thing I should have mentioned as well is the digital side of things. Obviously, there's a practice system involved, and arrangements will have to be made to transfer that data ownership, etc. Whatever happens, just want some assurance that those discussions are taking place as well.
Jill, would you like to come in?
I'll ask Rhian to comment on that, because yes, we do have to do that data transfer, and where it involves several practices, as it has happened in the past, that can be very complex. We are only talking about data transfer from one practice into the health board, so I hope it won't be as complicated as we've encountered before. But again, that discussion has to start, and there has to be agreement from the existing contractor that they're going to participate in that. Rhian, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thanks, Jill. Yes, Maynard will be working with DHCW, who manage our relationship with the system suppliers, to ensure that there is that smooth transition of patient records across into whatever the agreement is today from the board, and that recommendation around how we move forward. It's a conversation that we have on a fairly regular basis with them, so we already understand the parameters and the timelines around doing that. So there would be no shortfall for any patient, regardless of the outcome today, in what needs to happen to their records. And that is obviously all tied up with information governance and all the relevant protocols that we need to have in place.
Thank you, Rhian. Steve, would you like to come in?
Yeah, it was just on a process issue for members of the public who might be listening. We've mentioned bringing something back to board in December. The intention would be that would come to board seminar for discussion in December, with a paper for public board in January, and that's normally published within the first 2 weeks of January. So we can have both an internal discussion about what we've learned, potentially involving members of that community group, and then we can bring a paper to board in January, just so people are aware when it will be in the public domain.
Thank you, Steve, for that clarity. Jill, you mentioned when you were introducing the paper, some of the feedback from the members of the public, the patients, was the concern in relation to the dispensing rights, which rest solely in the GP who is resigning. But you said the community pharmacies could offer more services. I wonder if you could give us some information about what more services, if this does happen, a community pharmacy could offer.
Thank you, Chair. And again, Rhian might add to what I say, but our community pharmacies already, to varying degrees, offer a range of enhanced services. And this is tied up as well within contract reform of our community pharmacy services. Community pharmacies used to be funded traditionally on dispensing numbers of items, so all the drugs they dispensed. And through contract reform, that's changing to a much more focused approach on well-being and health and well-being, preventative, etc. So there's a range of enhanced services that now exist through our community pharmacies in terms of medicines review. We have some pharmacies that operate sore throat test and treat. We have a whole range of services and advice that can be provided through our community pharmacies that you wouldn't get through just a dispensing service. So I think we've got probably about 14 or 15 different enhanced services that I'll ask Rian to comment on as well. But there's a real benefit in terms of being able to access some of those services. And, you know, when we've done campaigns previously around Choose Well, we not with just that campaign, but we continue to promote the opportunity to use other services within our community for patients, which means they don't need to access secondary care services or even their GP, because there are services that pharmacies can provide for them. And I know that there isn't a community pharmacy directly in Solva, but it doesn't mean that patients will have to register with a community pharmacy. They'll be able to go into wherever they go to their shopping. There could be a community pharmacy nearby that they can dispense their prescription, etc. So again, and access some of the wider services that are available at that time. So Rian, would you like to comment on the work that we're doing with our community pharmacies around the development of our...
Thanks, Jill. Yes, I think we're quite fortunate in Hywel Dda that we've had a very proactive relationship with Community Pharmacy Wales and with our pharmacies. So as Jill said, we've got lots of services that they're able to provide, including the Common Ailment Scheme, medication use review to make sure that patients are taking their medication safely. We have a sore throat test and treat service. We have a UTI test and treat service. We have a number of community pharmacy walk-in centres that provide that enhanced range of services. And I know that work continues to go on with the team around looking at a number of other schemes that we would wish to develop. We're also probably one of the only health boards that has a GMS and community pharmacy enhanced services review group. So we really are looking at how we broaden and expand the range of services that patients have easy access to within their own communities, whether that's in their GP practice or their community pharmacy. And Jill is right. We have in the last 12 to 18 months seen a move away from items dispensed being the sort of currency that we see in community pharmacies to that wider service provision. So it is something that they are really open and welcoming at the moment.
Many thanks, Rian. I'm going to bring in Rodri, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I can only praise the amount of consultation, the level of consultation in this. There's a lot of work gone into this, which is very important. And on the same line as what Maria, you said just now, the dispensing, and you're quite right to say one of the chief concerns expressed by patients was this. I just wanted to know if determined that the dispensing rights should be reinstated following review of the provision of services under the PNA. Obviously, what would the timescale be for something like that? Obviously, there would be a consultation on that, but just for me to have clarity on that. Thanks.
I'm not sure that I know exactly what the timescale would be, but we would probably have to talk to the CHC around the level of time that we would need to talk to the wider public in terms of their needs. And we would do the mapping, but we have all of that information available to us already in terms of where our other community pharmacies are situated and the services they provide, and then determine really whether there's a gap that does exist. Or it could be that the pharmaceutical needs assessment says that it's reasonable that there are other community pharmacies relatively nearby. So not wanting to preempt the outcome, I would hope that there would be a minimum period of engagement of say 4 to 6 weeks, but it may be that the CHC determines we need to do a longer length of time, and we would be checking the regulations because pharmaceutical needs assessment is a very new regulation. So I would need to go back and check if there is a minimum timescale that we would need to engage with patients in terms of seeking that. And I think then depending what the outcome was, so if the outcome was, establish a new community pharmacy, clearly that's a longer piece of work. If it is about then re-establishing dispensing rights, then there would be an element of legal and regulatory practice that we would have to go through to consider whether or not those dispensing rights can be taken on by a managed practice. And so that would be the discussion that we would have at that point. I would hope that we could do that as quickly as possible, Rhodri, but wouldn't want to commit or mislead members of the public at this stage, because this is something quite new for us to do.
Yeah, thank you. I think the report is very clear, and there's no intention, no misleading at all. And I think it's very kind of clear, but thank you for that answer.
I'd also like to say, based on Rhodri's question, and also based on what you say, Jill, to try and do it as quickly as possible, and based on most importantly the views from the public, the quicker the better, really, in the most thorough way. But communication is key. If the public could be kept updated during that process, because I'm sure there'll be concerns wanting to know the outcome of the process. So thank you. Are there any other questions? Based on the discussion that we've just had and the comprehensive consideration of all the evidence by the Vacant Practice Panel, which was chaired by Jill, are the board happy to accept all the recommendations before us today? Yeah, thank you. Also, based on the discussion that we've had, which was as well as considering Solva, which is very important, we considered the GP practices and primary and community care within the whole of Hywel Dda. The board's content that we have seminars so we can have time to discuss that in more detail. As Steve said, one size doesn't fit all. If we can learn from how this progresses within Solva, within the community, and then we look to have a draft primary and community care strategy at the board meeting in January coming. Is everybody happy to agree that as one of our decisions? Many thank you. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank every member of the public in Solva, all the community, the community council, politicians, the local authority, everybody who took the time, particularly coming out on dark winter night for consultation, filling in all the forms and giving us your views. They have been absolutely central to this discussion. And central to the consideration of the Vacant Practice Panel. Feedback from other managed practices are very positive, and we as a health board will do everything that we can to ensure that there is a smooth transition. And I'd like to thank Jill, Rhian and the whole team for all the work they've done in communication, in engagement, and in consideration of this detailed evidence and complex situation at such speed, which is so important to the local community. So thank you, everybody. So I'd like to bring the board meeting to an end, and the date and time of our next meeting is the 30th of March 2023. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you, everybody.